what's happening when and how, so it's going to happen right now. This panel is a little bit different from the earlier sessions this morning. This is the temperature of the nation. And we have a broad spectrum of people who, while the earlier panels were sort of dealing with palace politics, our panelists here are dealing with other issues in South Africa that touch on it or that are affected by the palace politics. And without further ado, we'd like to welcome our rather large panel. John?
Yes, we've got some great people. By the way, the mystery guest isn't Trevor. No, it's not Trevor Manuel either. So let's see who it is. But first, please welcome Zwelinzima Vavi, former Secretary General of COSATU, currently convener of the Workers' Summit. Zwelinzima Vavi.
What's happening on that particular front, the temperature there?
So I think you also asked me to speak first because I'm the only woman on the panel.
I'm also, on the panel. Only black woman on the panel.
So, look, I think that often when we talk about race in this country, you have two reactions. And the first, typically for an audience like this, is a bit of an eye roll. Like, this is divisive, it's taking us backwards, why are we still talking about race 22 years later? And I think that in many ways the conversation about race in South Africa is a conversation that is important because it's about the connective tissue of our society. So it's really a question of trust. When the race question is not dealt with properly in this country, then we have a context in which people don't trust one another. And I think unfortunately in the last decade we've seen a slippage of the narrative which talked about where we were going sort of together as black and white. And so in the absence of anyone holding that space and helping us to think through these questions jointly, I think we've got a bit of a free-for-all. And so whoever has an opinion says it, and whatever weight has this weight, and so on and so forth. And in some ways that's wonderful, right? It's robust, and it's interesting, and it's fun. But we also, I think, unfortunately have a ruling party that's abrogated responsibility in that regard. So that's why I think in South Africa it matters. I think we can talk about globally, there's a whole range of issues that are happening around identity politics, but for South Africa it's beyond identity politics. This is class politics. This is a politics of the future. Race matters in South Africa because it will determine the extent to which we trust one another as a society.
Mr. Vavi, I mean, when I introduced the panel, virtually half of them I used the word former, and no disrespect to Robert McBride, but you're hanging on tightly, so you're not former too. And it really does raise this question for me. In South Africa, isn't it a hard fact that once you're out of power, you may be an irritant to those in power, but you really don't have any substantial way of changing the society's trajectory?
It depends on what you're putting on the table for mobilization of the people moving forward. We were kicked out of COSATU, not me alone, me and hundreds and thousands of workers who had different views to the views of the majority inside the small boardroom. And we continue to exist outside, and we continue to mobilize workers. We are now in a process to rebuild the trade union movement afresh, because we believe that the trade union movement in South Africa, which was led by COSATU, have been fundamentally weakened as a result of deliberate political agendas. And I believe that this is not just about issue affecting COSATU, but almost every organ of people's power have been weakened, fundamentally divided. And that agenda to weaken, hollow out, domesticate goes further than just targeting COSATU. It goes also to the other important institutions of state power, the NPA. Here's another victim there of the same agenda. There are many others, NPA and the Hawks, the police themselves, and it goes to the state-owned enterprises. I was listening to the very lively discussion earlier about the same agenda. That's what is happening, yes, unfortunately, to the rest of society. And I was listening to your poet very carefully about what she had to say, about how we are keeping quiet and arresting the person that should be coming out and speak out against all of these things. And we keep him quiet, unfortunately, not to the benefit of the country, maybe to the benefit of ourselves in our safe spaces and everywhere, But unfortunately, the destruction of the workers' unity is part and parcel of a larger agenda to re-engineer South Africa altogether. Re-engineer the ANC altogether, the SACP, the other organs of people's power, so that they, not me, is former. Far too many organizations that they think that are relevant are actually former.
Okay.
Robert, Mr. McBride, I think Mr. Vavi's just touched on a very important issue here about state capture, about who is behind this, but I think the most baffling thing for all of us when we look at this is, what is the reasoning? It seems to be no ideology behind the removal or the targeting of people who were once loyal ANC cadres who were put into positions, yourself being one of them. We're looking at General Shadrach Sibiya. We're looking at people being persecuted, Anwar Dramat, Ivan Pillay, Minister of Finance. I think it's for the general public, this is an extremely disturbing development. There seems to be no playbook. There seems to be no reasoning behind it. You yourself have called the Crimes Against the State unit, which have been called in to investigate people, the Gestapo wing of the Hawks. I mean, those are very strong sentiments about what we're facing and extremely alarming. What are your feelings about that aspect of what is happening in the state capture narrative?
Well, I think first on a lighter note, you must say the people behind it have either got struggle envy or MK envy, because their targets seem to be communists, MK members, and ANC members. And the point I was making on a less lighter note is that what the apartheid police failed to do, because of the struggles of the people, the Hawks under the Gestapo-like Crimes Against the State unit is doing exactly that. So they're targeting communists, they're targeting ANC people, former MK liberation fighters, and other ANC members. So that's the point. But on a much more serious note, the issues relate to institutions and dismantling of institutions. And as anyone would know, the institutions in any society, whether it be it's a school, the church, or the youth club, if those institutions work properly in a society, it usually ensures those societies become successful. And it's more so in democracies, and particular in constitutional democracies like ours, that if all the different cogs in the machine are allowed to function independently, hold the executive to account, you would have a successful state. The fact that there's an attack on all institutions that are dealing with anti-corruption investigations, so whether it's IPID, whether it's DPCI, whether it's SARS, whether it's other elements within SAPS, there's clearly a orchestrated campaign to dismantle and render useless independent state institutions and institutions of accountability. We've actually identified who those people are.
Iraj Abedian, we'll come back to that, Robert McBride, but let's talk about the economy. I mean, people talk about growth as a transforming force. My sense of South Africa is exactly the opposite, that when it's business as usual and the economy is pumping, the people who hold the levers of power in the economy actually don't think about transformation at all. And that transformation is more strongly driven by a crisis. Your response to that thought?
I think it could be the case. That is true that when times are good, executives, investors are busy with making money and they don't want to be confused or sidetracked with other issues. That's absolutely right. The other side, however, is not symmetrical. It doesn't mean that in bad times, even if they want to do it, they could do it. So growth is one thing that is like breathing in human body. Whatever your ambitions, your beliefs, your intentions, for God's sake, don't stop breathing. Because the minute that you breathe, all your ideals will also go down with it. Economic growth is left to literally to luck at the moment. From an institutional governance point of view, we're suppressing growth. We're undermining, however politically, and then I've sat here and elsewhere, we criticize for very good reasons. We should criticize, but every criticism in every society should be balanced with some proactive growth-promoting, job-creating, developmental process at the same time. You cannot let that process go, and everybody is now a critic, everybody is a political activist, nobody wants to promote jobs and growth in the economy. However, crisis could be a platform for rebuilding the economy. And if that's what you're saying, do we have an opportunity now to use the crisis? And it is by all standards, whatever matrix you use, South Africa is going through a crisis. From a governance point of view, from an economic point of view, from income disparity point of view, from youth joblessness point of view, whatever is your measure of indicator, right, left, center, I don't care. But from where I sit, I see an economy gripped by all undesirable forces, both internally and externally. That we cannot allow. Whilst we are busy fighting all these fights, we got to also put in motion an engine that will keep breathing going, which will enable those who want to rebuild, to reconstitute, have a fighting chance.
Is this life support machine going to be in a public hospital or a private one?
I think it should be a joint venture. I think the Minister of Finance is doing a sort of initiative that I believe is the right platform. And my personal belief is that right across the political spectrum, racial spectrum, whatever your ambitions, we need to rally around that initiative. Will say, whilst we are fighting our social, political, and ideological battles, let's also make sure that our economy does not fall off the track. Remember, the global economy is in a very, very uncomfortable space at the same time. So we have external forces against us, and we cannot afford to be busy with destructive, self-destructive processes and not take care of the inevitable, unavoidable breathing that we need to do.
We have an NDP, a National Development Plan, which is something we all seem to agree on but can't ever get to.
NDP is by all measures forgotten, because the cabinet, which is meant to be the champion, the central engine of NDP, by definition, is busy with other things.
Yes.
Half the cabinet doesn't know what NDP is, and I challenge half the ministers to say that I have read it. They don't know what the content is, and that is the problem.
So it's theatrics. I mean, Mark, I think civil society, too, is feeling threatened. There are various laws. I think that last year you gave an incredible input about the role of civil society and what the Constitution, the transformative power of the Constitution in terms of the Freedom Charter, that the promises of the Freedom Charter are contained in this Constitution. Your feelings around the temperature in South Africa now, from civil society's point of view, and from a pushback against a playbook that none of us really understand?
Well, I think civil society may not have seen anything yet, in the sense that the worst is still to come. You know, just as we were sitting here today, I saw a report in Africa Confidential talking about a new piece of legislation that will require the registration of NGOs, and particularly foreign NGOs, and which will limit foreign funding to NGOs. And that has already happened in India. It's already happened in China. It already exists in Russia. And as we know, the people who have captured our state power look to China and look to India for models as to how to control civil society. So I think you're going to see legislative attempts to control civil society, and I think you're going to see more nefarious means used to attempt to take the wind out of civil society. And there's a reason for that, is because, you know, I guess the challenge that civil society represents is the challenge of people recapturing the politicians. The politicians, this may sound odd to say, have stolen power. They've stolen power away from the state in the way it's meant to be directed back to meeting ordinary people's lives, and they're using it for their own benefit. So we have to reconstitute that civil society power. We have to demand once more that there is accountability to the Constitution, accountability to the communities. And the problem is the politicians don't hear the communities anymore. It's what Iraj just said. The noise of JZ is so loud in your ears, and of the other people, that the noise of the communities, whether it's for toilets in schools, whether it's for nurses, whether it's for doctors, it's drowned out. You don't pay any attention. It's that other big noise, and unless we change that, we're in trouble. So I think what's happening in South Africa at the moment in many respects is about how do we build new powers? How do we build powers that we trust, now that the powers that we vested our trust in for a very long time have shown themselves to have ulterior and selfish agendas, and to be prone to surrendering for other motives. That's why civil society represents a threat, because I think civil society, sorry to say this, Zweli, but perhaps more than the trade unions for a long time, has shown by using the Constitution that it is still possible to mobilize power and to win social improvements for people in this country. We're not without power. We mustn't forget that. A huge amount of power. It's given to us by our Constitution. The question is, are we going to use it properly?
So when Mark spoke about capturing politicians, is that the same as state capture, or is this a different version? That's a joke, sorry. You don't have to answer it. Jay Naidoo, you in your work have traveled the world a lot. You've met people from other countries with ideas. Are you hearing any fresh, interesting ideas about growing our economy, deepening our democracy? And if you're not, do you have any idea why?
Well, I've just landed this morning from a think tank convened by Sam Petroda. Many of you wouldn't know who he is, but he was the architect of India's IT revolution in 1980, when he went to work for Rajiv Gandhi, then the Prime Minister, for 1 rupee a year. And he took India from being an agrarian poor country to it being an IT superpower today. And basically, I think this is, if I look at the debates and hear the debates in the world today, we're stuck in the 19th century with ideologies and thinking and a paradigm that is 19th century. We're sitting in a world which since the mid-90s has gone through a digital technological revolution that has had a greater impact on the way we live, we organize our lives, the way we access service, the way we communicate, bigger than the Industrial Revolution had in its time. And yet, we sit within institutions, whether that is government, whether that's the United Nations, whether that's trade unions or civil society, that emerge out of the Second World War with a commitment of leadership then that development will stop war. But it's 70 years old. The world has moved on. And yet we try to do what Einstein defined as insanity, do the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. The world has changed. What is the nature of work today? So when someone comes out here, particularly politicians, and promise to create millions of jobs, you must tell them they are lying. Because the notion that there are someone going to create jobs for you, even in Europe today, there are millions of young people walking the streets in casual labor, highly educated, because there are no jobs. The technology revolution has changed the nature of work. Do you know that within 10 years, the prototype is already there? We will not need drivers for our cars. Would we need traffic lights? So if you start to think about this, where will jobs come from? How will we create jobs? And this is where we go back to the basics. If you look at Africa today, we have 1 billion people in Africa, half of them under 19. By 2050, we are 2 billion people in this continent. What jobs are we going to create for them? So if you think back and think about our resources, what are the resources of Africa? We're the richest damn continent in the world. But we have 1 in 3 people hungry, compared to the international average of 1 in 9. But we have 60% of the remaining arable land in the world. What do? We have our governments giving our land away. Big corporates, big countries who have destroyed their own land and now need to feed their own populations. So what stops women who are subsistence farmers who produce 70% of our food from becoming successful smallholder farmers? Well, it is land title, it's access to a bit of finance to finance their own seed banks, their own nurseries, water, irrigation, power, and then give them access to the market. So we have a deep debate about land reform in this country, but we're missing the point. Who needs support? I would very definitely support that land should be returned to communities. But what do they do with that land? And that's where we need new ideas, new paradigms of thinking, and that's what is absent. It's a deficit, but South Africa is not unique. This deficit is global today in the world.
And I think perhaps feeding into that deficit and looking at how I think governments are becoming increasingly kind of not able to deal with this problem is the violence and, of the response towards citizens demanding something different. We see an increased response. I mean, I didn't think that I would live in a country where I have to leave my telephone in another room when I meet people in case national intelligence is listening to my phone call. That was something that happened to us in the 1980s. I find that incredibly scary. And that students are arrested and thrown into the back of a van. So, Sisonke, the violence that is being, I think, acted out in the arena where the students are pushing back and resisting our service delivery protests, we see also increased lack of engagement, increased securitization. I'm surprised we haven't got a special unit that drives around. Robert, this also feeds into your discussion around people at the moment who we don't know, who are turning against ANC and MK in particular. Is there a hangover from the past, an untransformed network of people? I mean, this sounds very much like a James Bond thing, but it's not. Who are somehow behind the increased paranoia and securitization of South Africa.
Yeah. If I can just demonstrate to you, the Minister of Police recently defended an apartheid-era policeman, and I can understand that we're in the process of reconciliation. But if that apartheid-era policeman continues doing apartheid-era deeds, then he needs to be criticized. How is it possible that the head of our Hawks is an apartheid-era policeman who used to go after ANC, liberation fighters, communists, still
apartheid.
does it now?
Not just apartheid, Bandostan.
Yeah.
Bandostan product, head of the Hawks. There have to be an agenda why you want to do that.
Yes.
You're not just like going to the head and close your eyes and take up anybody. This is about transformation. This is about an agenda. And this is just exactly what I was talking about. As soon as you pick up Bandostan era apartheid regime operatives to head your institutions 22 years into our democracy, as soon as you take a social worker and you affirm her as the head of the police, and then you get shocked when there is a Marikana. As soon as you take Nomgcobo Jiba, who have lots of things to answer in court, and you protect her through Sean Abrahams, you must know that there's an agenda that is underway. And that's the point that I think that you are making and that I have been making in public. And that agenda is not happening on its own. It is being driven politically. And it starts from the headlines that we will get today, that our head of state was in court again for the 2011th time to make sure that he never ever goes to court to face the 783 charges of corruption, fraud, and money laundering. That's where the problem is. And I know that I'm partly to blame for that, but that's exactly where the problem is.
Yeah. So I think as an ordinary person who's reading the newspaper and who doesn't understand the intricacies of factions and this, I mean, it's incredibly hard to keep track of all of these things, right? And it's easier when you're in them and you know the personalities and the characters, but some of us who weren't born yet, it's like, what is going on? And I think what's important about what's going on is that it's an agenda and a politics of attack and defense, right? So we are no longer in a politics of imagination, in a politics of rebuilding a country, in a politics even of reconciliation, whatever we may think of that. We are in a political moment that is about defending someone and attacking other people. And so that's the map that I think we need to understand, that that's the reading. It doesn't matter the details. I mean, to some extent it does, but really for the public, the details matter less than what this agenda is, and it's agenda of attack and defense, which makes it very hard then for us to think creatively about the future. And yet this panel is this is a panel about the future. And I think that part of what happens is that we are so busy reacting and trying to figure out, our media is busy trying to figure out the fissures and the cracks and what is this? And then it makes it difficult for us to listen, for example, to the conversation that happened this morning, where some really interesting contestation of ideas is there, right? We can't ask the questions of politicians about what their vision is for the future because we're so busy trying to focus on these little things, and that's on purpose. It's a very distracting, very destructive moment, but that's on purpose. And I think it's very important for us to lift our eyes off of those things and be able, as South Africans, to think about what is the future we want to make with or without this current crop of politicians. They will go. And in the meantime, we need to have an agenda for what is taking us forward.
Iraj, I know you want to come in there, but I want to ask you a question just as a follow-up from what you were saying earlier. Do you think that there is any substantial commitment from the people who control this economy to redistribute in ways that will actually cost them their own wealth?
No, and that's why
No,
the
I was
EFF
asking
is
Iraj.
important. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Sorry. That's why I was going to say that's why the EFF is important.
Yes.
I cannot speak for everybody, but I know from circles that I am in the business, there is absolutely a willingness to create a new future. This new future must have a different discourse, must have different parameters. Part of those parameters is redistribution, but redistribution has to be on a sustainable basis. Part of that discourse has to be a very important point that Jay raised. I mean, if we had the time, ideally, in 2016, a gathering of this nature should have a session entirely dedicated to those issues. What does it mean for our youth? What does it mean for our education system? Whether you are white, black, rich, able, disabled, sidelined, it doesn't matter. Those issues are critical for the future of the country. Now, we are not doing that. Is a core in the business who wants to do it? Those who want to stay in South Africa, yes. Those who have a foot here or a finger here and the rest of the wealth is there, they watch this soap opera and they clap, they said, we told you so. And that is, my submission is, whether you're an EFF, whether you're an ANC, whether you're, that's the issue that we got to have a gathering about. If we put the real issues on the table, real business people, meaning those who want to stay here and build the country, will come to the party.
So Jay, can I ask you the same question? Because we could have been having this conversation in the early 90s where you couldn't swing a cat without hitting a businessman who is committed to the future. But we're 22 years in. Have you seen a mindset change in capital?
Well, I think if you do not see it, you're blind. And then, certainly you are disabled. I think that if you look at the statistics, 1 in 3 people living on a social grant, 1 in 3 people unemployed, 1 in 3 people hungry, in a country that is enormously wealthy. It's an indictment on all of us. If you cannot see that there's something wrong in this country, we are all in serious trouble, particularly corporates. Then you have 60% of young people coming out of 12 years of education with very few skills, no job, and unlikely to have the dignity of labor in their lifetime. Those are the real issues. Politicians think like publicly listed companies in quarterly results and then 5-year terms. If we want to solve the challenges, which are intractable challenges requiring a very different set of new ideas, which require us to take risk, we've got to think in 10, 15, 20 years' time. So what is the opportunity? And I think that's where, even in the little projects that I'm doing with workers evicted from farms, even today, where a white farmer will cut off water to a village because he accuses one individual of stealing a jacket but has collective punishment against, and the ANC in that municipality does nothing. That's happening today. And if you think that there's no anger, South Africa's we've always been angry about something or the other. You know, but there always was the notion, in 1976, it was Steve Biko who said, you know, we have nothing to lose but our chains. But he gave us a direction. He didn't give us a business plan and wasn't a donor, thank God. You know, we need less of these people around. But he gave us a direction, and we were able to organize that anger and channel it into building at a community level, which was painstaking. It took us 18 years to be in a position to create the democracy that allowed Nelson Mandela to be the president. That's forgotten today. And that's the work that has to take place. And I'm saying, if you cannot see that, if we cannot have that conversation here as the mainstream, and not playing to an audience, but dealing with the real issues, and I don't see any politicians in this country dealing with the real issues. If you look at Africa, and I do a lot of work across Africa because I sit on the Mo Ibrahim Foundation board, you know, if you look at the opportunity, there's 700 million people in Africa without electricity. Now, you can look at that and say it's a cup half empty. I'd see it as an opportunity. We have 300 days of sunshine. And yet we're going down the old fossil fuel route. We're going down the nuclear energy route because it benefits someone's back. We could create a whole industrial strategy around renewables that will create millions of jobs and that will make us meet our commitments in terms of the Paris Peace Protocol. And this is the new thinking that I don't see coming from the political debate. It's been diverted by the noise. And we, the people, need to bring it back to the real issues. But we need business to stand up and be counted, not just when it hits their back pockets. Yeah.
Mark, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, look, I agree that we need to spend much more time talking about the vision. We need to spend much more time talking about how we can reorganize this society in a way that makes it possible to implement the promise of the Constitution, to give people better health systems, to give people better education systems. I see two problems. The first problem is that we're not coming together, all of us. So, you know, when we leave this panel, Jay goes his way, Vavi goes his way, Sisonke goes her way, Iraj goes his way. We're all having the same nightmare, but we're not coming together to say, how are we going to fix this nightmare? And until we come together somehow around that vision, we are going to be outmaneuvered. And we're going to set ourselves up for failure, even if a new set of politicians come along. Very populist, very attractive in what they're saying. They're no more guaranteed than the current set of politicians. But what adds urgency, I guess, to what I'm trying to say, is we don't have a lot of time. You know, we talk about this soap opera, and we're very preoccupied with the soap opera these days. But underneath the soap opera, there's about 50 million people whose lives are getting destroyed. Education system is, you know, I've spoken here twice before. I called my first speech in the shit 1, and the second speech in the shit 2. This speech should be called, Will We Ever Get Out of the Shit? Because the damage is becoming irreparable. You cannot fix broken education systems in 5 years, broken health systems, broken water irrigation systems, broken agricultural systems. Even if we get the most wonderful government in 2 or 3 years' time, the damage is being done now. And that should make us all think, we've got to, you know, it's not just about the maverick, it's not just about academic, we've got to go out of here and start to solve these type of problems. Otherwise, you know, it's a scary situation. I'm not pessimistic. I think this country has fabulous human and other resources. You know, I agree with Julius when he says we can fix many of these problems, but the time is against us now.
I just wanted to fold in something around business and the role of business, and also the role of business in the chaos that we have to measure our way through, because we shouldn't forget that the hand grenade that was thrown into the heart of SARS was done through a multinational corporation.
Yeah, I think business is caught now in a very, very unenviable position. It is supposed to compete globally. It's supposed to cope with the technological revolution. It's supposed to keep its employees together. And I'm no speaker for business, but I'm sharing it with you that if you were in business today, you would have a hell of a challenge, because those who are supposed to create certainty in the environment for doing business, these institutions that I think Robert was referring to, are the very institutions within which you have the comfort of making long-term decisions. But if these institutions themselves become the source of destabilization or adding additional uncertainty, then business, when in doubt, they have to chicken out.
But what if they're supporting those political parties? That's why we need to see who is
business, I think what you're referring to in strict language of business is not business.
Okay.
What I'm talking about, that's why I said the businesses who've got a finger here and the body out there, there are businesses who become extraction machines in the name of business. They are business only insofar as they have a PTY Limited registered in their name, but they've put no money in it, they don't put effort in it, they've risked nothing, they will never risk anything. That, to me, is not a definition of business. So we must separate, when we talk about, incidentally, it's the same with politicians. There are politicians who are in politics to serve people, and there are politicians who are only occupying the political office by hook or by crook. Business is the same. There are businesses who see opportunistically they're much easier without risk to get multi-billionaires. There is no business who is legitimate, who can, without innovation, can become billionaires in less than a generation. If you are Facebook, if you're an IT, you have to put something creative in. Anybody who becomes a billionaire without risking a generation of money is a crook, is not a business person. So it's as simple as that. So there is a very simple test. Now, if we see we're talking about SARS, the issue of SARS is about those who have captured the loots, they've banked it, but they do not want to pay the taxes. Who they are, I don't know, maybe Robert knows, but there is
they're very big multinationals.
There are multinationals, they have become billionaires on the back of a certain connections, not on the back of the sweat of their risk-taking or the sweat of their families or their own innovation. Therefore, when we talk about business, it's very important in this fracture situation, we do not create more fracture. We talk about business as if business is unpatriotic, as if every business is a crook, business is that. That is a connotation of what we're talking business. The same way that we should be careful not to talk about politicians as if every politician is a self-serving politician. There are many politicians who want to serve the national interest. So we need to be very nuanced in this very chaotic soap opera. Every time that you think you understood the plot of this soap opera, the next episode proves you wrong. And we got to be careful not to create more fractions.
Robert, Mark Heywood referred to irreparable damage, and the area in which you've been working and fighting the battles that are well known. When you get poison of that kind into systems like that, do you ever get it out?
Well, it'll take a very long time, because you would see yourself now, if you're a motorist and you're driving on the road, you get stopped willy-nilly for no offense, and it's expected that you will pay cold drink money. If you've got a burglary at your home and you want some attention to it, you've reported it, you've even got CCTV footage, you have to pay the detective to actually do his work. So that's the extent in which society's values and trust in the police has diminished. So if you've got police as an institution right across the whole policing environment and sector, people have lost trust in the police. Now, the National Development Plan talks about being safe and feeling safe. South Africans don't feel safe. They don't trust their police. They are not safe. Police themselves are getting killed because people are starting to disrespect police. People are even recently robbed the police station. That's the extent of the condescension and contempt with which they hold the police in South Africa. But that is the process of undermining institutions, acting unconstitutionally, and acting illegally. And that's been happening for some time now. So it must have an impact, and the impact cascades down to all of us.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. We were supposed to have an hour, but we started a little bit late. So in those 5 minutes, can we offer to each of the panelists a chance to tell us if they see any light at the end of the tunnel and clarify whether that light is in fact light or just an oncoming train. Do you want to go first, Zwelinzima?
In my view, we are in a dark hole on two fronts. The first front is the political front, and we've spent large amount of time yet again in this panel to talk about that political crisis. But we are also in a dark hole in relation to the economic transformation crisis, that the majority of our people are getting more unemployed, more into deeper levels of poverty. We have become the most unequal society in the world. And the most frightening part of it is that we are not talking about that every day. That's not our narrative. The headlines are not about what is that should be done to address the crisis in the education, which is absolutely in a terrible state. 50% of our kids leave school before they reach grade 12, and a small percentage of them go through universities with degrees that can matter in terms of changing the lives of ordinary people. The health is in a terrible state of affairs. Go to any hospital. If you are a denialist and just give away your medical aid for a week and see what will happen to you. We are not talking about that. So the solution ought to be about what is that we can do from the civil society point of view. And that's why I'm so preoccupied about rebuilding the trade union movement in South Africa, because I know without a strong trade union movement, without a strong civil society organization, we will get deeper and deeper into the crisis. I don't care who says what. If we can't fix those two problems, we are just in trouble. So we've got to begin a process of engaging South Africans about what matters to them. And what matters to them are two issues. Fix the politics of the country and fix the economic crisis that is bedeviling the majority in our country.
Should we go to Sisonke?
Sisonke?
Yeah, I have to say, I'm really, this morning's bike lane conversation was fantastic. I'm still kind of, if today was election day, I think even many people in this room would be thinking about the fighters as a real contender. And I think that's an interesting thing in terms of the future, because there is a way in which South Africa's head has been turned towards the minority of us, not just white people, but middle-class people. So the bike lanes is a really fantastic metaphor for the sense in which our heads have been turned towards a small minority with very specific interests and ways of being and thinking lightly, right? And I think the entrance of the EFF is extremely important for all of us, not whether you vote for them or not. The way in which they have articulated, whether you think it's populist or not, the way in which they have articulated and refocused our attention on the questions of the majority of people in this country are fundamentally important. And for me, if there's any future that South Africa has, it's a future that is focused on the majority of people. Whether you believe you want to reorient the ANC to focus on the future, whether you believe the DA is going to reorient on the future, but there's no question the EFS have made us remember that we've been looking at bike lanes when in fact we need to be looking at flush toilets, and that's crucial.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, following on from Sisonke about focusing on the majority of people, I'd make 3 points. I think one of the most important things we've seen in the last 12 months is the way the young people of this country have now put their hands up and signaled the desire to shape the country. And that fact is not reflected in discussions like this, sadly. I mean, I was looking out there a minute ago, if I was to say, if you're under 30, put your hand up. If you're under 30, put your hand up. See? Where's the young people? We've got to bring the young people into the discussion, to lead the discussion. And the same thing that has to happen is we've got to bring women into this discussion properly, because that hasn't happened. in this conference, and that's a problem. The second thing I want to say is we've got to find a focus. If we as a country can't focus on the crisis in our education system, everybody, and say we're going to turn that crisis around, whatever it takes, within a couple of years, then there isn't much light at the end of the tunnel.
Absolutely.
And I believe if we all put our shoulders to that wheel, we could create an economy or economies out of fixing the education system. We get all sorts of benefits downstream because instead of employing armies of consultants to run our government departments, the people who come out of our education system could begin to do that. We have to do that. And the third and final thing I want to just say is to the politicians who I think have all left, particularly to the ruling party politicians. You know, we lived through Mbeki's AIDS denialism for half a decade. When Mbeki was gone, you can't find an ANC politician hardly who says, I didn't shut my mouth, whilst he was busy denying people antiretrovirals, going to court, spreading all sorts of nonsense and so on. I can tell you in a few years' time, when JZ has moved aside, that the same bunch, whether it's Zweli, whether it's others, will all start telling us, we were against JZ, we were trying to do this, we were trying to do that. And it's not good enough. And they should know now that doesn't wash. So they need to make their minds up now or never, otherwise they're forever tarnished.
Okay, Robert, final thoughts?
We've got a red light flashing, and it's not the EFF. It's to tell us that we're on the end. So,
Okay. Now, for me, to take a cue from Mark, the future lies with the youth, and not in a cliched way, but from the experience which we saw in the Fees Must Fall campaign which was well organized, had great depth to it, was disciplined, and people from different organizations, student organizations, and political parties amongst the youth were able to work together effectively and to understand the different challenges. And for me, when I saw that, I believe that same level of sophistication of campaigns and of resistance to apartheid on a general scale can be done by the youth today against poverty, against inequality, and against corruption and abuse of state institutions.
Thanks. Iraj, if you can keep it brief, please.
Yeah, I think my 2 cents point is the South African economy is incredibly resourceful, both at the human level, but also at the economic structure. It has had over 100 years of challenging similar situations under apartheid, pre-apartheid, etc. What we cannot do is to give up hope. We need to create a forum for dealing with those 2 issues that Mr. Vavi mentioned. And the sooner we do it, time is not on our side, the better.
Jay, briefly if you can.
Yeah, I sometimes wish I was 30 years younger, because this is the organizer's dream in this country. Every day you have some politician or some businessman shooting themselves in the foot, and we complain, and you don't get thrown into jail nowadays for standing up and organizing against it and building something new. So be courageous, man. I really get disappointed by South Africans who endlessly complain, and yet we have rights. We have a constitution that defends our rights to demand things, demand accountability, demand good governance. So what the hell is happening with you South Africans, And I think that, I think that's what we've got to do. We got to give hope. We got to share our experience, and people like me in my generation got to admit our mistakes. But we also got to say that there's some things that we have given you that you can build on. We gave you a constitutional democracy. We didn't complete the economic transition. We didn't do the land reform that was required. That's why the EFF is right. And those that have power have to do something about it. Otherwise, you will share nothing. And if we want to build a forward that is full of hope and a pathway of opportunity, let's do it together.
thank you very much, everybody. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Let's go. A luta continua.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys go off.